Om Parthaya Pradibodhidam Bhagavata Narayanena Swayam Vyasena Grathidam Purana Munina Madhye Mahabharadam Advaidam Radavashinim Bhagavadim Ashtadashadhyayinim Ambatva Manusantadhami Bhagavad Gite Bhavadveshinim Yam Brahma Varunendra Rudramarudastunnyantu Divyaistavaihi Vedai Sangapatakramopanishadaihi Gayandiyam Samagaha Dhyanavasthita Tadgatena Manasa Pasyanti Yam Yogino Yasyandam Navidusura Suraganah Devaya Tasmai Namaha. We are discussing the sixth sloka, the sixth verse of the sixth chapter of the Bhagavad Gita. So we started the discussion of this verse, Bandhuratmatmanastasya yenatmaivatmana jitaha anatmanastu shatrutve vartedatmaiva shatruvat. So, when does our mind become our friend and when does it turn against us? If we can have our mind as a best friend, a philosopher and guide, then there will be no problems. A mind that instinctively guides us to the spiritual path, that gives the red signal when an undesirable thought arises in the mind, the mind itself steps in to interfere and gives a warning. That mind is our friend. When our mind is not controlled by the senses, not controlled by desires for sense objects, then that mind is our friend. And when the mind is controlled by the sense objects or senses, that mind can never be our friend. So the best way to befriend our mind is to connect it to something higher than mind itself, because mind is naturally very unstable. It is wavering all the time. A continuing stream of thought currents which are somewhat irregular, disorganized, but continuing like a flow. That is what we understand by mind. Sankalpa Vikalpatmika Antakarnavurti. That is the definition of mind in Vedanta. And generally speaking, in all systems of Indian philosophy and even in modern psychology, this view is accepted more or less. A continuing stream of consciousness, you may call it, or maybe awareness. That's what mind actually is. It's not always continuous in a state of harmony, but it continues in a state of mutually conflicting thought currents. Now it is happy, then it is unhappy. That is because the mind is always being dragged into external sense objects by the senses. The eyes, the ears, the sense of touch, sense of smell, sense of taste, all these five senses drag the mind. Such a mind can never be stable. Such a mind can never be a friend of ours. But if that mind is under the control of a higher power, rational thinking, the determinative faculty called Buddhi in Vedanta, then that mind is disciplined. Then it becomes an instrument, a tool a means for our own good, our own welfare. Then that mind becomes our teacher. But this happens only when we are able to control and conquer the lower self. So what we call the lower self is a mind that is a tendency to follow the dictates of the senses. That is the lower self. It should be controlled and restrained. Then the mind is linked to our higher self, Atman. Then it becomes our friend. That's how we reduce conflicts that we frequently face. What is the conflict? The conflict between what we want to do for our good and a tendency to postpone that action, a tendency, a reluctance to follow, an unwillingness not often clearly expressed but strongly felt. We often find we want to do great things, good things that we know is necessary for us, is beneficial to us, and we earnestly desire it, but we are not able to do because the mind suddenly creates a stumbling block. Laziness, attraction to the senses in modern times, that power of the lower self, the power of the mental negativity expresses itself in the form of infatuation, extreme attachment to things that we know to be harmful to ourselves. Drug addiction, gambling, obsession with the modern internet. It's needed, it is a tool, it's an instrument, it's necessary for us. It's a means to, maybe in modern times, a means to survive. But when we become obsessed with that, there you can find the play of an unfriendly mind, a hostile mind, that continuously drags us to do things which are obviously harmful to us, which we want to get away from, but not able to. So that's why Lord Krishna makes a very powerful statement. And the statement is, Bandhuratmatmanastasya, that positive aspect of our mind, the mind that is linked to Atman, that is linked to higher faculty, that is Buddhi, a discerning wisdom, that mind is our friend. But a mind that is moved away from the spiritual values, Atman, so that mind is varted atmaiva shatruvad. So atmaiva shatruvad vartade. It acts as if it is our own worst enemy. So that's a very interesting point, remember. A flashes of this phenomenon you find in Dostoevsky's Brothers Karamazov. The protagonist sometimes says, when Ivan Fyodorovich Karamazov says, in a very interesting, we have a right to assert, to do what is harmful to us. How can God take away from us our own right to do what is obviously harmful to us? You can find such distorted logic. Logic standing on headstand, Sishasana. You can find many such ideas. The inherent perversion of the mind, our own mind, that perpetually takes us away from what is good for ourselves. So that's why varteda atmaiva shatruvat. So atmaiva shatruvat vartade. Means that mind which has moved away from our own natural instinctive tendency to do what is good for us, spiritual values. we just moved away from that and moved towards what is harmful to us. That mind is an unfriendly mind, a hostile mind, and we should be very careful. We should guard ourselves against this peculiar mental phenomenon. It's a very, very potent, very strong statement with a deep insight into human mind. Lord Krishna says we should always link our mind into something positive, creative, constructive, something that is good for us, something that gives us the feeling, an inherent feeling of spiritual contentment. And that can be achieved by connecting the mind, linking to the mind to something positive. If we cannot directly direct our mind to spiritual values, give it a direction to philosophy, to higher music, higher culture, mysticism, all these, because these subjects, intellectual subjects, will take the mind away from its wavering, its hostile landscape. It will give good occupation to the mind. Mind is properly employed. Not very properly, but employed in a way that it doesn't become our worst enemy. A mind that is busy with philosophy, a mind that is busy with higher music, higher art, spiritually elevating branches of learning. A mind is always busy with that. That mind may not take us to God, but it will help us to move away from, to get away from obviously harmful channels, for negative channels. Again, the 7th verse continues the discussion. Jidatmana prashantasya paramatma samahidaha sitoshna sugadukheshu tatha manapamanayoho. Now, how does a man or a woman whose mind has become his or her best friend, mind becomes our guru, mind becomes our guide, our philosopher, our mother, our father, loving, affectionate parents, mind acts like that. When the mind is restrained, when it is directed towards spiritually elevating ideas, such a mind becomes calm and quiet, and this becomes natural. This equipoise, this inner equilibrium becomes natural for a person who has risen himself or raised himself to a higher level of spiritual evolution called yoga rudha, somebody who has stepped into or established in yoga arudha, who has raised himself onto the platform of yoga. Such a person is called yoga rudha. It is what you can find here. You can find, we already discussed this subject much earlier. Yoga rudhastadocyate. Yadahina indriyartheshu na karmasu anushajyate sarva sankalpa sannyasi yoga rudhaga tada uchyate. In the 4th sloka, this is mentioned. When a person is free from attachment or aversion, when he is free from any kind of attachment to sense objects, when he has given up all sankalpas, all concerns, all worries, who has focused himself on the higher spiritual goal in his mind, such a person will naturally be established in yoga, established in the spiritual contemplation, the contemplative mood. He has already got into the best that will take him to his spiritual destination. That's why. Such a person is called prashantah. He is self-controlled. And jidatmanah is completely self-controlled and is prashantas paramatma samahidaha. He is constantly focused on the realization, the Supreme Self, the Atman. Well, in the monotheistic language, we can say God is his object of constant realization, constant contemplation. He's calm and quiet, he's self-restrained, controlled. For him, cold and heat, pain and pleasure, honor and dishonor are the same. We cannot take a decision, if tomorrow onwards I shall try to look upon pain and pleasure with the same equipoise and then practice. We cannot do that. We cannot all of a sudden take a decision tomorrow onwards or today, now onwards I shall look upon pain and pleasure with the same equanimity of mind. We cannot do that. Honor and dishonor, we cannot do that. Through making a decision, we cannot do that. But by focusing on a higher transcendental ideal, we can do that. So the only way that we can look upon these empirical worldly experiences, three pairs of the opposites, worldly experiences, sense experiences, that is heat and cold, joy and sorrow, honor and dishonor. Heat and cold doesn't mean physically that you should be the same in Alaska. You should wear the same cloth in Alaska or maybe in the polar regions, in North Pole, and you should wear the same cloth in the extreme hot regions. It is not the physical, not in the physical sense that these words are used, the pairs of opposites, heat and cold. What it means, the opposite experiences. Our mind should not be disturbed, mind should not lose its equipoise. When extremely enjoyable circumstances arise, or extremely painful circumstances, under both these mutually conflicting scenarios, we should be able to keep equipoise, we should be able to keep our mind in balance without being disturbed, without losing its equipoise. So that is the implication. Sitoshna sukhadukeshu tatha manapamanayoho. So in extreme heat and extreme cold, we should be the same. It is not a physical, the implication is not that we should remain the same, having the same dress code in both extreme cold and extreme heat, not at all. What it means is, we should not become overjoyed when things are going on fine for us. If we ever lose our balance and get lost in extreme enjoyment when everything is fine, when things are going on well, then there's a danger, and when there is a slightest disturbance, in that scenario, we will become extremely grief-stricken, with extreme heat, extreme cold. So the only way to avoid the problem of losing balance in a painful situation is to guard ourselves when we are in a pleasant situation. And this is possible when we raise our mind above pain and pleasure. When we direct our mind to a higher transcendental level, thinking of God as the one reality where everything is the same, or Atman, which is beyond pain and pleasure. Pain and pleasure is something empirical. They are related to the level of worldly experiences. And at the level of worldly empirical experiences, there cannot be the same experience continuing. It's like two sides of the same coin. One side is pain, the other side is pleasure. So, if we are going to get lost in enjoyment, then we will cry and weep in painful circumstances. So, better we should always remember, we should not lose our balance, enjoying a good situation, enjoying when everything is going on fine for us. So, at that time, we should restrain ourselves. Then we will be able to restrain ourselves in painful circumstances also. This is possible when we raise our mind beyond empirical, beyond the worldly level of experiences, and reach a higher transcendental level. When we think of Atman, when we think of the presence of the divine, the all-pervading divine presence of God, when we think of that, then pain and pleasure are the same. You can find this amply demonstrated in the lives of great saints in all traditions, in all spiritual traditions. Because they were busy and engaged in prayer, in reading scriptures, in chanting the name of holy name of God, they were not affected when they had to face problems, and they were not overjoyed when everything was wonderful for us. So that inner poise, equipoise of the mind can really come only when we focus our mind on something higher and transcendental. The same is true of joy and sorrow. Sitoshna sukha dukkeshu, Sita ushna, sukha dukkha, honor, dishonor. Now this quality of inner poise becomes natural and instinctive, becomes part of our spiritual instinct when we practice spiritual values. Now Shankaracharya has got something very wonderful to say in explaining this subject. He says, how does such a person becomes, how does he become prashanta, when he is establishing prakashena shanta, absolute peace and calmness and quietude and inner tranquility. So Shankaracharya says, jidatmanaha karyakarana sankhataha atma jitaha yena sa jidatma tasya jidatmanaha prashantasya. So Shankaracharya explains, how does such a person become fully established in this inner poise, inner tranquility, inner peace? Prashantasya prasannantakaranasya sataha sannyasinaha paramatma samahitaha sakshan atma bhavena vartade ityarthaha. Such a person's mind, it becomes identified with Paramatma. So Paramatma is the term used in Advaita. Let us say in the ordinary monotheistic terms, we can interpret it this way. A person who is always focused on God or spiritual ideas, his mind becomes one with God. That's why, prasanna antakaranasya sataha sannyasinaha. Such a person is a man of renunciation, and his antakarana, his mind, his ecosystem, all the memories in his chittam, all become calm and quiet because they have become merged in the God idea. Then what happens? Such a person's mind, atmabhavena vartade, such a person's mind functions as God. Your mind becomes your God, not normally. When your mind is focused on spiritual practices, your mind becomes your God who's sitting within you, guiding you. Now, there are certain very strong, important external characteristics of such a person. He is Jidatma. He is completely self-restrained, self-controlled. He is Prashanta. He is experiencing extreme tranquility and peace and contentment within. And his presence also gives extreme peace and contentment to everyone around him. Not only to those who belong to his own religious persuasion, not only to his own people, but his presence becomes a spiritual light for the whole humanity. The great spiritual teachers in the world, how do we find that people, certain great spiritual teachers, they are revered, they are respected, they are honored, but everyone, not necessarily by those who belong to the religions that they founded, but they become universal spiritual lights, spiritual ideals. That's because their mind has become one with, their mind has become identified with the universal mind, the self, Atman, God Himself. Such persons become universal spiritual symbols. So that is the real sign of a great spiritual teacher. A Buddha or a Shankaracharya or a Sri Ramakrishna or a Christ, the examples of universal spiritual ideals. Their appeal is not limited to their own followers, but if you read Vivekananda's complete works, his teachings, his lectures, he is addressing humanity as a whole. So you find the universality of their appeal is rooted in this interesting aspect. Their mind, their thoughts, their ideas have become totally identified with the universal welfare of humanity because they have become one with the universal, with the entire humanity. So you can find the discussion continues. Jnana vijnana triptatma kudastho vijidendriyaha yukta ityuchade yogi samaloshtasmakanchanaha. How they become so well established in their inner balance, inner equipoise, in their equilibrium, the calmness and quietude of their mind, all explained here. Their heart is filled with a unique kind of contentment or satisfaction by knowledge, the spiritual knowledge, and also realization of that knowledge. So jnanam means knowledge or wisdom. Vijnanam means experience, inner realization of that spiritual wisdom as a fact in everyday life. That is called vijnanam. Jnanam means knowledge, wisdom. Vijnanam means when that wisdom, when that knowledge becomes a real experience every moment of our life, then it is called vijnanam. Now, such a person, their contentment remains changeless, their senses are completely under control, and another interesting aspect of their equanimity of outlook is emphasized by a unique statement, Samaloshtasmakanchanaha. For them, Sama means the same, a lump of earth, a piece of stone, and precious gold are the same. Gold is something that everyone wants from a worldly perspective. It is very important, very valuable. and a piece of stone, a lump of earth are practically useless things of no value, really speaking. Now, for a spiritually elevated person, yoga rudha, it makes no difference. In Sri Ramakrishna's life, you find he actually realized this for a fact. He could see precious gold and mud, soil, as of the same thing. I mean, they were the same for him in his eyes. So when you reach that level of equipoise, it is possible. In fact, many of these great spiritual teachers, they didn't want anything for themselves. They didn't have any desire for themselves. They must have founded monastic orders, they must have built up temples and churches. But the real mystics, the real spiritual epoch makers, they did not want anything for themselves, though they may have made use of all these things for the benefit of humanity. So there is an interesting story in the Indian mythological literature. In the Mahabharata, you find Janaka was a great king. Now, Janaka was a big emperor, a very rich man, and somebody one day reported to him there was a huge fire, a conflagration, about to consume his palace and his buildings and his entire capital city of his kingdom called Mithila. So, Mithilayam pradagdhayam name kinjit pranasyadi. So he replied, my city is burning, but I am not going to lose anything. It doesn't mean that as a king he neglected his duty. He made arrangements for putting out the fire. He may have made all arrangements for saving the population, the city and all its everything. But then he said, Mithilayam pradagdhayam name kinjit pranasyadi. The city is burning, but I am not going to lose anything. I am not going to lose anything, because the real I is not a person who values for the precious things in the city. The real I is Atman, because his mind was so focused on God, on Atman, so that he could lose everything. Still, he would feel that he has not really lost anything, because all those things do not belong to him. The real I is something different. It is the universal Atman, the self. So that is an example of this particular kind of experience. So you can find such a yoga rudha. He will be free from all attachments from sense objects. He will be free from desires, and he will have this inner equilibrium. And not only that, he said, jnana vijnana truptatma. He is experiencing a tremendous inner feeling of contentment and happiness, because he has realized, he has understood the truth, and he has realized the truth. Jnanam is understanding the truth, vijnanam is realizing the truth. So jnana vijnana truptatma. And kutastha. So kuta means an anvil, a block of steel or metal that is used by people in different such professions to make tools or instruments. Kuta is an anvil, very strong, unshakable block of iron or steel, and you put something there and you strike it, but the anvil is not at all affected. he remains steady and stable. It's unshaken. So kudastha means unmoved, undisturbed. Such a spiritual person, such an advanced person of spirituality, his mind is unshaken, unmoved like kudastha. Because his mind is fully in control of his senses. The senses do not drag his mind towards sense objects. The senses are fully under his control. So his mind is his best friend. So the mind is one with Atman. So he is experiencing this freedom from desires, freedom from attachment to sense objects, and he remains totally unmoved and undisturbed even in adverse circumstances. And that is the natural characteristic of a spiritually advanced person, a yoga rudha. And again, he is establishing this tremendous, indescribable inner tranquility and peace and contentment. Jnana, vijnana, truptatma. He has learned the knowledge, he has the wisdom, and he has experienced that wisdom in his everyday life, and every moment he is realizing that wisdom, the practical spiritual aspect of that wisdom. That is the meaning of jnana, vijnana, truptatma. Now we will go to the 9th verse, which is a very, very interesting verse, which has got a spiritual significance. Suhrimitra yudasena madhyastha dvesha bandhushu sadhusha vichapapeshu samabuddhi visishyate. How he looks upon people. So far we were trying to understand a yoga rudha, a spiritually advanced person, by explaining how he is fully established in tranquility and peace and happiness, is totally undisturbed, and his mind is his best friend because his mind is linked to Atman. Such a mind becomes your guru, your guide, your friend, and it becomes your everything. But the same mind, when detached from spiritual ideas, from God, that mind becomes entangled by the senses which drag that mind to sense objects. That mind also can become your enemy. So it's always very important to feed your mind with good ideas, positive ideas, and to link the mind, to keep the mind linked to a higher spiritual perspective. So that helps us to look upon others from a higher spiritual perspective. That is explained here. So the well-known verse is very important here. It is Suhrimitra Yudasenam Madhyastha Dvesha Bandhushu Sadhusya Vichapapeshu Samabuddhir Visishyate. So there is a Samastapada is the Suhrimitra Yudasena Madhyastha Dvesha Bandhushu. In Sanskrit it's called, Samasa Vigraha. Its splitting is called Vigraha Vakyam. It is Suhrutcha, Mitramcha, Aricha, Udasinaha cha, Madhyasthaha cha, Deshaha cha, Bandhuscha, Suhrimitra Yudasena Madhyastha Dvesha Bandhavaha Teshu. That's the meaning here. So, these words are very interesting. Of course, the simple translation can be given, then we will explain what it means. Such a yoga rudha, spiritually exalted person, he looks with equal regard, with equal attitude, with the same attitude upon his well-wishers, upon his friends, his enemies, and those who are neutral to him, and those who are not taking either side, those who are hateful towards him, and those who are his relatives, and upon the righteous and the unrighteous person. I mean, their attitude will be the same because their focus is on a higher level. So for the higher spiritual level, when you look at the world will not disturb you. So there are two ways of looking at God and the world. If you look at God through the world, then you will have no peace of mind. You will be interpreting God by the language, by the plurality, the diversities and the conflicts of worldly experiences. But you look at the world from God, from a godly perspective. If you look at the world through God, then what happens? You can look at the world and the world will not disturb you. If you look at God through the world, then you will have your own ideas about God. But if you look at the world through God, then you will be able to look at the world from a spiritual prism, spiritual perspective. And then you will be able to practice this equipoise, you will be able to practice this equilibrium of mind. That is prasantatma vigatabhi, such a person become prashanta. So this is explained here. So the first word is suhrut. In this suhrmittarudasena madhyastha dvesha bandhushu. It's a long word. So we are analyzing that. Suhrut means, suhrut is a friend. Somebody who may give you good advice, who may do good to you without expecting anything return. Such a person is called suhrut. Shankaracharya says, suhrut iti pratyupakaram anapeksha upakarta. Means a friend, an ideal friend is one who will help you without expecting any help from you in return. That is suhrut. The second word is mitram. The mitra is a person who is well disposed towards you, but he may not always be able to help you. So Shankaracharya's interpretation is mitram snehavan. He likes you and he may want to help you, but he may not be always able to help you. So all mitra may not be suhrut means. So that's the idea. So in Sanskrit dictionary, if you go, suhrut and mitram can mean the same thing. But Shankaracharya, from a philosophical and psychological perspective, he analyzes these words from a higher attitude, higher perspective, Vedantic hermeneutics, so to speak. So suhrut and mitra. Then the third word used is here, ari. Ari means enemy. Somebody who is secretly working against you. That is obvious. And this spiritually exalted person, yoga rudha, he will not have any feeling of animosity or hostility towards those who are working against him. His attitude towards his enemy will be the same as his attitude towards his friends, his suhrut or his mitra. There will be no difference. That's what the verse is going to tell us. The fourth word used is udasina. Udasina, somebody is somewhat indifferent. So Udasina is a person, he may not care either for enemies or friends, is totally indifferent. That person may not be an spiritually exalted person, but he won't help anybody and he won't do any harm to anybody. There are certain persons, sometimes you find, there are people, if they are your friends, you are not going to be benefited by your friendship, if they are your friends. If they are your enemies, you need not be afraid of them. So, as an enemy, he is harmless. As a friend, he is useless. Such a person is called Udasina in Sanskrit. That is Vedantic hermeneutics. The fifth word used is Madhyastha. There are certain persons, he may not take either side, this side or that side, but he will be wishing good for everyone. So Shankaracharya says, Madhyasto yo viruddhayoho ubhayoho hitaishi. He may like to help all. Such a person is called Madhyastha. Ubhayoho viruddhayoho hitaishi. He may be working for the good of either side. The sixth word used is dveshya. Is a person who normally acts against us, and we know about him, so we are not in good terms with him. We don't like him because we have seen him to be working against us. So he is an object of our anger. Such a person is called dveshya. Dveshya atmanaha apriyaha. That is Shankaracharya's commentary. The seventh word used is bandhu, sambandhi, iti edeshu. So, he is those who blood relations, is related to him through blood relations, have a special favor for him. No. The spiritually exalted person will not have a special consideration for those who are his blood relations. He may not favor somebody who is helping him and may have an unfavorable attitude towards those who are not helping him. This equipoise, this balance, inner equipoise and balance is natural and becomes his second nature. So then shastranuvartishu abhicha papeshu pradishiddhakarishu sarveshu eteshu samabuddhi. Kaha kim karma iti avyapada buddhi tyarthaka. So what it means is, there are those who are who may be acting good for us and who may not be acting good for us. So you can find different types of people in this world. Those who are our friends, Sukhrut, Mitram, then Ari, Udasina, Madhyasthaha, Dveshyaha, Bandhuhu. All these are 7 types of people. So these 7 types of people represent 7 possible attitudes, 7 different attitudes that we may have when we interact with them. There are people who may be Suhrut, friends, ready to help us without expecting anything in return. They actually deserve our gratitude. A spiritually exalted person will be grateful, but he will not go out of his way to show special gratitude by doing everything for him and by doing nothing for those who are not helping him. Or be always in hostile terms with certain people and always in extremely pleasant terms with certain other people. So these are possible variations in human nature, in human attitude, in our interactions with others. So our mind will change, its attitude, its approach, depending upon whom we are talking to, whom we are interacting with. A spiritually exalted person, his mind will not vary according to circumstances. As I mentioned earlier, this equipoise, this inner balance of mind, can be attained not by acting, but by feeding our mind with great spiritual ideas and by lifting our mind away from the world, lifting our mind to a higher consciousness. And from that higher consciousness, when you look at these possible fluctuations, these waverings, these varieties, these mutually conflicting characteristics of different people whom we meet and interact with in our everyday life, our mind will remain calm and quiet and tranquil. It's not that we always smile at everyone, not in that sense. We may have to smile at people, we may not smile at certain other people, but there will be no aversion within. We won't be depositing a piece of negativity, negative samskaras, when we interact with people whom we do not like. That dislike may be observable in our external behavior, but will not go very deep. In our mind, we will have the attitude. This is human nature. This variety of human temperament is part of life. So, when we reach this level of spiritual maturity, then we will be established in this equipoise. That's the only way to become prashantatma. I mean, a state where mind is established in prashanti. Prashanti means all comprehensive tranquility, peace and contentment. So, this is the 9th verse. It is a very important verse. Then 10th verse, yogi yunjida sadadam atmanam rahasisthidaha ekaki yatachittatma nirashihi aparigraha. So, if a person wants to be yogi, again we should remember we are not talking about hatha yoga, we are not talking about physical yoga, we are not talking about yoga asana, we are talking about higher spiritual life. That's the real implication of the word yoga in the context of Bhagavad Gita. So, yogi yunjida sadatam atmanam rahasisthidaka ekaki yatachittatma nirashihi aparigraha. So, as such a yogi, he should constantly practice this concentration. And normally, such people will have a tendency to be left alone. And that's why ekaki, he will have a tendency to retire into solitude. Alone. A natural tendency for solitude. Remember this very, solitude is a great blessing for those who are ready for it. Solitude is very dangerous for those who are not ready for it. It's an important point to remember. This solitude is mentioned here and in many places in the Gita. So, it is mentioned in many other contexts also. Maicha ananya yogena bhakti avibhicharini vivikta desha sevitum anabhirjana samsadi. You find many other contexts Gita uses. Gita refers to a natural tendency for higher spiritually exalted people, higher spiritual seekers, to have a natural liking for solitude. But remember, solitude becomes enjoyable, becomes a blessing only for those who have a natural tendency for it. Of course, you find many of the greatest spiritual teachers in the world had at some point or other in their life, they had this liking for solitude. They spent some time, sometimes some years in introspection, in meditation. You find the lives of Jesus Christ, you find in Buddha, you find in Shankaracharya, you find in Sri Ramakrishna, you find great spiritual teachers. Even Vivekananda he wanted to be left alone, but he had to be busy all his life, you find. So those who have this natural ability to enjoy solitude, they alone will be able to do great work among the people in public. Those who want public, they will not be able to do much good for public, because you accumulate spiritual wealth only when you practice, you enjoy solitude. It is in solitude that we accumulate wealth, and later we distribute that wealth among the people. That's why in the lives of all the great spiritual seekers, Jesus Christ was left alone in the desert, did practice for 40 days, he practiced solitude, introspection, meditation. Buddha did the same. He sat under a tree. Ikasane sushudu me shareeram tagasti mamsam cha vilayam chiyatuhu aprapi siddhim bhu janma durlabham naivasanat kaya madaschalishya. You find in the Ashwagosha's Dhvajarita. Ashwagosha describes how Buddha decided to sit under Bodhi tree in Bodhgaya with a strong determination. I shall sit here, I shall meditate and let my body perish unless and until I realize the supreme truth. I will not get out of the seat. And he meditated for years. And you find the same thing Shankaracharya did. Sri Ramakrishna was living in the world of God, the world of meditation and prayer for years. Vivekananda again and again wanted to be left alone in solitude when he was wandering. Out of this solitude comes the strength to work in public. Because you have to accumulate wealth, then only you will have enough wealth to distribute among others. So, that's why it's interesting. For spiritual seekers at the beginning, it is important, but solitude doesn't mean physical solitude. If a person tries to physically create a solitary atmosphere, he will not be left alone. His own mind will be always disturbing him, teasing him, tempting him, frightening him. He will be living in some kind of physical solitude. But if he is not ready, his own mind will not give him one moment of solitude. That's why for a beginner in spiritual life, good action, karma yoga, good practice, studying scriptures, regular meditation, and also karma yoga, all these are important, so that eventually we will be able to reach a stage when we can enjoy solitude, and solitude becomes a blessing. So we will discuss that subject again in the next session. Thank you. Namaskar. Om Shanti 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 Harihi Om Tat Sat. Sri Ramakrishna Arpanamastu.